Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Refuge Podcast. Today, Josh chats with Vanessa Soltero Martinez about her journey as an immigrant in this country, navigating what it means to be a bridge builder and a mover and shaker in a society that does not support our flourishing as BIPOC folk, and particularly as someone who for many years was not documented. Vanessa shares her experiences and how she's healed and grown and leaned into her identity and into the work of our collective liberation. Vane is so fun to listen to because she tells it like it is and is confident in doing so. And we definitely need to listen to more voices like hers. So I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did.
Welcome to another very special podcast. Welcome to the Refuge Pod. I'm so excited to have a friend and colega here. Vane, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. If you would like to introduce yourself, please. We're going to get to scratch the surface on your story a little bit today, but please, for folks who don't know who you are, please, who are you?
Thank you. Yes. My name is Vanessa Martinez Soltero. I am an immigrant. For my family and I migrated from Mexico to United States. My family came first and then I came later, but I was born in Ensenada, Mexico. And my maternal lineage is actually from a place called Colima in Mexico. And that's where I grew up for the first 12 years of my life and went to school and spent all of my childhood being raised by my grandmother. So I come from a very long line of strong matriarchs. So my grandmother, my grandmother's mother, and my mother. And now, they got together and that's why I'm here.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that a little bit. And when you say 12, like where did you move then at 12?
Then when I was 12 years old, my mother had finally gotten enough money to be able to get a bigger place and bring me to the United States. So then I came to Orange County, California, specifically to the Garden Grove area, where both my parents worked in the hospitality industry. So that's what they've been doing for, a long time and how they've been able to support our family. So I grew up in Orange County, California, and not like the South County area. It was more like with the raza and, it was very diverse, actually. So it was very good to have that experience, even though, Orange County, most people's minds of Orange County is very limited and just like white folks, which we did have a lot of, I'm not going to lie. But there was also a lot of Latinos, a lot of mostly Mexicans, but also Asian Americans. So my experience always has been through food. So it's always like eating, having lunch after school at my Korean friend's, house, eating, kimchi, homemade kimchi and all of these things. And then I would in turn invite her to my house and she could have, tacos and pozole and all that good stuff that we have. So that was my experience in the United States and learning, right? And so part of my encouragement to learn English so fast was because my family already spoke it, but also because I wanted to be exposed to all of these diversity and cultures that I didn't have as much of in Mexico. So that was a very good experience.
Yeah. How much Korean food did you eat in Mexico?
Not much. although I will tell you though, in my neighborhood, we did have like Jewish and Mexican neighbors. So one of my friends growing up was Jewish and Mexican. And then another one of my friends, they were Chinese, German, and Mexican. So there was a little bit of that, but they were like la novedad, right? They were not like, it wasn't common. But yeah, Korean, definitely not. And curiously enough, though, my Korean friend here was born in Ecuador.
Oh.
So she had a similar story to mine where like her dad from South Korea migrated to Ecuador to get them ready, brought the mom over. She was born in Ecuador, my friend. And then when they were ready, they were able to get a visa and migrate to the United States. So it was really interesting to find these people in my life also, that had been migrating before they even came to the United States. And I feel like my migration was, going from Ensenada I was months old, and I migrated within Mexico to Colima, and then I came, to the United States. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious too, like what that was like. Obviously, reflecting back, right, on 12-year-old Vanessa coming to here, but like, what was your experience like coming to a new country? Not just migrating from one place in Mexico to another, but like coming to Orange County here. What was that like?
Yeah, it was. I think it was a lot of mixed feelings, right? Like I'm coming into adolescence, right? And so like things are changing. I had just graduated elementary school. I went to junior high school for like a few months before I actually came over here. So I started school late here. But it was, just the language shock, the culture shock,
right.
And culture even with like other Latinos, right? Like I was still very much a child, very much. I grew up in a small town. We didn't grow up in the big city. So everybody knew everybody, the neighbors knew. And then coming here into a city, in Garden Grove, where like my mom wouldn't even let me walk down, to the liquor store, by myself. And so, yeah, it was a lot of firsts, definitely a lot of like adapting, learning, how to navigate. Even just school was so different. Learning was so different because of the language barrier. And our school, I'm grateful we had a really good school district, but in retrospect, I'm also thinking about all the racism I experienced, and a lot of the racism, a lot of my classmates experienced with white professors, teaching ESL classes, and as I like picked up the language a little bit more by the second year that I was here, I could just like hear the racist comments, but very like, you need to adapt and assimilate, right? So I think from a very early age, now that I look back, I think about all of also the institutionalized racism that is experienced for people of color, for migrants of color, when we don't look the right way or don't speak the right way.
Right.
So I would always get, I remember I would always get this look of shock, with some of my professors when I would speak English, because I'd only been here for 2 years and I was in 8th grade, and I was testing at, higher levels. And it was just so interesting, like there's shock in their face, like, oh, you speak English so well. And I'm like, yeah, my family's been here, like but it was just one of those things that you don't think back until you're older,
right.
About all the bullshit you have to, and like 12-year-old me, 13-year-old me didn't get it.
Right.
But I've also been a fighter too, because in high school, I was put in an ESL class and I was getting bored because it was easy and I just like didn't find it challenging.
Right.
And I had to like advocate for myself because my parents, obviously, were always working. So I remember meeting with the vice principal, meeting with my counselor, and my counselor finally said, I'm going to give you a chance, right? Like she's giving me the chance, and I'm going to put you in a regular English class, but if you don't do it by the first semester, if your grades go down, you're going to have to go back to your ESL classes. And I like showed that bitch. I'm like, I got an A that semester.
That's
but it was just like, but it was like those things, right? Where like advocating for myself and like thinking back of all the things I had to do because, my parents had never been, my mom didn't even finish elementary school. So, whatever the teacher would say, it's like, oh, your teacher's probably right. You should probably stay in ESL.
Right.
So always like learning to, advocate for myself. And I felt like that's always been like that fighting, in me. That I always had to fight, and I always had to just, nobody was going to do anything for me if I wasn't the one leading it, if I wasn't the one, pushing for things to change. And that's probably why I ended up, doing social justice work.
Yeah, no, I definitely, it totally makes sense, exactly what you said, right? How that shaped you and the lessons, right, you learned. And as you reflect back, right, the lessons that you've taken away. And I'm curious if there's other things that you think, like, how that experience shaped you to who you are today, in your life's work, right? Your calling, your vocation.
Yeah, I think also part of like, being here and being undocumented for so long, right? Why immigrant rights work was just such a natural avenue for me. I was in a blended status family, even when I came here, where some of my family members were documented and some of us were not. And I had gotten a scholarship before I graduated junior high school, and they needed my social security number. And I didn't know what a social security was. Like, I didn't, you don't have a concept when you come here, you know that you don't have papers, but you don't know what it means to not have papers. You don't know what the barriers are and how people are going to react, to that. So I learned from an early age, not to let people know about my status out of fear. And so I had gotten a scholarship of like $500 at the time. It wasn't a lot. And it was going to go to a trust and all that. And so, one of the professors that was in charge of the scholarship pool money, said, well, you just need your social. And I was like, okay. So I just went to my mom's house, like after school. It's like, oh, yeah, I got the scholarship. So my mom was happy. And then she said, oh, but I need, my social. And that's when my mom said, I think that's when I found out. I had been here already for like 2 years. And she said, well, you don't have a social. And I was like, well, I don't know what a social is, but apparently I need one. And she said, well, unfortunately, you don't have that, but you have this, right? So my mom also, like, I had a TIN number, something that they use for their taxes. So I, went in and told the teacher, well, this is a number that my mom uses. I didn't know the difference. I didn't know what was happening. Right. But I remember that teacher got really upset. And she said, if you knew you didn't qualify for this scholarship, why are you lying to me? Wow. So it was just like this thing where I was like, I'm not lying to you. I'm giving you something that, my parents gave me. And it was just like where those things where then you learn not to say anything. You learn not to, if you don't know for sure if things are for you, you don't even try. So I think like my life was that, and then being in high school and having my school counselor, my career counselor tell me I could apply to all these universities. I mean, AB 540 wasn't a thing yet, here in California where you could pay in-state tuition. So, my parents' options for me were always, we're going to give you education, but the system doesn't allow for your full education. So you can maybe go to vocational school and become, a doctor's assistant or, or something because of this, right? Or you could just go to work full time. But I knew that I didn't just want to be working, because I saw how hard my parents worked, but how little they got paid, and so I wanted something better for me. And I knew that things would change, right? So I thought, no, things are going to change, right? Like I would like read books about like 187, right? With like how people change things, read about like the amnesty of like the Reagan administration. And I thought, things are going to change and I want to be prepared for when they do. Right. So I always thought like, I'm still going to go to school. I was working full time and going to school full time for the first year of my college year. And that burned me out. Unfortunately for me, I took a 6-month break after I graduated, and then AB 540 passed in 2002. So I was like, okay, I don't have to pay, $500 per class. I can only pay, the in-state tuition, which I still didn't qualify for any grants, didn't qualify for financial aid. So I had to work full time, to help my parents, but also to help my education because there were 3 of us. And I was the first one, going to college, going to community college. And then I knew like I was going to transfer to university, at the time I wanted to be a psychologist. So I was like, I have to get my doctorate if I want to like do anything with this career. And, it took me like 10 years to graduate college for so many reasons, because you burn out, because you're working 40, 50 hours a week and still taking, full-time class schedule. So like there was no time for my social life. There was no time for anything, but I knew that, that was important for me. And so I think for me doing this work, I know what it's like to be undocumented. I know what it's like to have workarounds, around doing the things that you have to do to survive. But I also knew that I had to fight for what I wanted. Nobody was going to give me anything. I had to fight for it, and I had to be part of that change. If I saw things changing and I didn't like the way they were changing, I had to be part of that, so that I could also put in my 2 cents and put in my influence. So I was also doing it for a lot of my friends who didn't have, the same opportunities, maybe not the same family support, or, ended up being young parents, when we were going to college. And so their life changed. But, You know, for me, it's like I'm doing this for my community. This is something that I'm going to be benefiting from, but it's not just me. And so that for me has always been important, that I'm not doing things just for me, that if this is good for me, it's going to be good for someone else too.
No, that totally sounds like you. And again, felicidades, you know, in doing it. You said it took 10 years, but that's a huge accomplishment, you know, especially for people like us who our parents didn't study here, you know, that we're first generation college students. You know, sometimes our parents studied in their home countries, right? But that, you know, so that's why I don't just say first generation, because I know that's sometimes a problematic term. But that's a huge accomplishment, and, you know, it totally makes sense, everything you're saying, from having to advocate for yourself from an early age, you know, like, you know, the hustle that you have and the tenacity and you know, using your voice, you know, to speak up and to not put up with the BS. So, you know, I want to acknowledge you for the work that you continue to do. And I could totally see how that shaped the person that you are today, the leader that you are today. And you know, that last part that you said about it not just benefiting you personally, right, but your family and your community, like that's totally who you are. And you know, I appreciate people like you. You know, you inspire so many of us to continue on, you know, because like we were talking a little bit offline earlier, you know, it's like when you see somebody do something, like a dream that you have, you know, and you see, like, you think I could do it too, right? And, you know, it's not just like to for the ego personally, you know, like that's BS, right? Like it's important, right, to do it, but it's also not just for that reason. It's important to continue to pave ways, you know, because people have paved them before us, and to pave them for those that come after us. So I think that's totally what you've done in so many ways. And you know, you talk about the work. I know we haven't, like, for folks who don't know you, we haven't necessarily described the work that you're involved with now and that you have been involved with over the years. So I'm excited for you to share a little bit more about that too. But, you know, also I want to ask a question about spirituality too, right? Because I know it's interweaved. You know, the podcast, we have this tagline, sharing stories of struggle, solidarity, and spirituality, you know, kind of like those intersections, right? And how our different stories line up in those. And so what spiritual tradition do you find yourself in? I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about that.
Sure. That's a good question. I feel like I carry a lot. I grew up in a Catholic home, you know, like a lot of Mexicans, Catholic, but my grandmother was a very private Catholic. So she, you know, we lived right across the street from a Catholic church. She never went, hardly ever went. And, you know, as I got older and I went back, you know, once I got my papers, I went back and visited her to Mexico, and I would tell her, you know, Abuelita, why didn't you, you know, go to church a lot? And she was like, oh, because I can pray at home. And I would always see that she had, like, her San Judas Tadeo candle, you know, and, like, would always put ruda. And I thought, oh, it's to feed the horse. My child, oh, it's to feed the horse, right? Because it's green and the horse eats, right? But it was this mixture of indigenous, you know, spirituality and her Catholic traditions, right? And part of it with her resistance and her choques were that she had 11 children, right? And she grew up in a time where, you know, like, the Catholic Church didn't approve of birth control. And, you know, and so there was always, like, this, you know, institution telling her what she could do with her body or not do with her body. And I remember when we got older and, like, we actually were having these conversations, you know, she said, I regret that, you know, I didn't stand up for myself more. But she goes, that was the times. And so she'd always say that, you know, that was the times, you know, and the nuns would go visit her, you know, and sometimes bring her food for her kids because, you know, my grandfather was an alcoholic and she was the one always being the main breadwinner. And, but that the nuns would say, oh, that's, porque Dios así lo quiere. You have all these kids, because God wants you to have all these kids. And so, I don't know if my grandma had ever told anybody before, but I remember her telling me, she goes, you know what? So I told her, then God should come down and feed these kids because I'm tired of working so much and I can't even feed them. And that's, her faith, she has a strong faith in like the Virgin Mary and in God.
Yeah.
But there are all of these things about the institution, that she like chokes, So I feel like I'm the same way. I love, I love that Christianity and, including Catholicism embraced me. I asked her this questions because I used to be very close to the Catholic Church. I was 6 years old and I was helping the catechist teach catechism because I memorized. I couldn't really read, I was in first grade, going into second grade. But I memorized all these prayers for catechists, and my grandmother liked that I went, but, she wouldn't really go with me. And then when I came to the United States, my parents, had become Latino evangelicals. So we used to go to church like 4 times a week. It was just ridiculous. It was like a Pentecostal mixture with like another like conservative denomination, led by white people. But for Latinos, and I loved, like, I feel like I've always had this connection to Creator and in different ways, right? And the person who I was, the person that I was growing up in Mexico, fed my soul through the Catholic Church and through some of the indigenous practices that I didn't even know were indigenous practices.
Right.
And then with evangelicalism, I think it became this, it was like just the white Jesus religion of like individualism, right? But nothing horizontal, everything vertical.
Yes.
And, but my culture, right, your culture doesn't let you, like your culture also always brings you back to your gente, to your community. And it wasn't until college, that my missions pastor, and I think this is all like also how my immigrant, status always came to play. But I always had like Creator, whenever Creator wanted me to do something, there would be a way. And my missions pastor, Latino, in a Latino bilingual church, invited me to a missions trip they were going to take down to Tijuana. And I couldn't go because I was undocumented at the time. And he said, well, let me come up with something for the next trip because he said, I want you to come and the support for you to experience, a missions trip. So I was like, okay, sure. And he ended up actually creating, he called it like the Tri-City mission, whatever, right? Where we went to LA. We spent a few days in LA, we spent a few days in Miami, and we spent a few days in New York. So we ended up doing missions within the United States where like that wasn't cool, right? Where it was only like the white kids going to the ghetto, right? But this were like all these ghetto kids going to the other ghettos.
Yeah. Which is a huge difference, right? Like a huge experience.
Huge.
Yeah. Difference.
Huge. Yeah, and so, so even like going to LA, we've been to LA, we've been to the alleys, we know what it's like. It was the first time I met Michael Mata.
Yes.
When he was doing some work. So Michael Mata, gave us our tour. I learned a lot of things, about like you're like a fish, right? So if you're in the water, you don't know you're wet. But like I learned about the difference between graffiti and gang tagging, and like I learned these things. I was like, oh, okay. But it was more about the community, right? So I was intrigued about how people lived in community, how people survived. In Miami, we visited, Little Haiti at the time, right? So we were like, what people were doing, with Haitians, and not a lot of brown people, honestly. A lot of the people that gave us the tours were white, right? So we also saw, like, my friends and I would just kind of look at each other because it's all Latinos, Mexican Americans and migrants from Mexico. You're looking at like, oh, these white people, like infantilizing us and our communities. But nonetheless, I feel like those experiences, right, of like my Catholic tradition, my evangelical tradition, and lately this past decade in my 30s, I've been really exploring, my indigenous spirituality and learning, from the things that were kept from us. But it's like this, how like Madrina Alexia Salvatierra talks about the remembering, that I'm remembering my ancestors, but then they're also remembering me in the sense of like they're putting me back into this body, where I felt so apart. Yes. And as a migrant, there's everything makes you feel, right? like you don't belong, right? My status, like I didn't belong, even like dealing with other like Chicanos,
Right.
like not calling myself Chicana because I feel like I wasn't born in this country, but like we have this kinship, it's just different.
Right.
And, and I feel like my spirituality and my calling for justice, there is no difference, right? I don't do one without thinking about the other.
Yes.
I don't practice my indigenous spirituality without thinking about, what's happening in our communities, what's happening in even like our BIPOC communities, and how do we bring this liberation together, right? I don't think about them separately anymore.
Yes.
And I think I used to have to compartmentalize because that's what I was taught.
Right.
So there was a lot of unlearning of my own spirituality that I just had to surrender to not assuming that I knew or what was real for me, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It was real then, and I'm not going to discredit it, right? But what's real now, it's different and things change. And I have to be open to that change and if I want to, move forward. But a lot of the things that were missing with institutionalized religion for me were the remembering my ancestors, right? Going back, because none of them talked about that. None of them talked about the ancestry and the practices that why we're here, right? They were very surfacey. And even like, liberal denominations that are mostly white led are never gonna give me that because the theology is wonderful. It's a lot more progressive when it comes to social justice issues, but it's not bringing me, right? And I've been really blessed with like my missions pastor, that created this missions trip for me, with Reverend Lee de Leon. He was like my introduction to what it's like to love the community and my introduction to what the potential that organized religion has into really learning to love the community, right? But there were limitations. And at the time, my reality was that, and I just saw it separate. And then I met Madrina, over a decade ago, and she's talking about the love of God and the love for justice and how they're the same and, and how there's differences because there's got to be differences, but things mesh, and I feel like I've always been in that, some people call it like the third way. And I don't think there's a third way. I think there's just this, it's like water. So sometimes the current of the water is going to be cold and sometimes the current is going to be hot, but water doesn't stop being water, and I feel like for me, I'm never going to stop being me, whether I'm in a religious space or in a justice space. I'm just going to shift it. I'm going to adapt to whatever's happening, but there's got to be the essence of me. So, it's a long answer to your question,
It's
but
beautiful answer. Yeah.
Yeah, but I just feel that the remembering and bringing my ancestors with me, and also like acknowledging, the damage that organized religion has done to my people, and and there are good things, but I'm not gonna like wash over it and bypass the pain, right? And the things that still continue to be done. And for us, as people of color who have the privilege of going to college, or some of us who go to seminary, right? And they want us to think that, oh, well, we got brown people here, we got black people in these religious spaces, like we have been redeemed. And they're, and you haven't. And maybe not in our lifetime will reparation ever happen, but you do have to have the humility, and the posture to listen to us and really listen to us, and also listen and do reparations with your money, but with your power, and that sometimes that you got to honor those parts of the body, that were dishonored for so long. And that means that you got to, lessen yourself. And that's the liberation for me, right? I feel like liberation theology that comes from like Latin America, but even from Africa, right? From these folks that stayed in these institutions that have shed some light, but they were only able to do so much, right? Because the work has to continue being done. And so we're not done yet. So like white people aren't done, like honoring the parts of the body that they have dishonored, Exactly. And so that's where like I see God focusing more into that part.
No, definitely. And I appreciate you not just trying to put a label or like, that's totally what this platform is for, right? Really getting a chance to share a little bit of our stories. And, I so appreciate that response to the spiritual tradition you find yourself in, and so resonate with it, and I think a lot of people, hopefully, right, that are listening to this or viewing this will also And, really appreciate what you said about the remembering. Like, I think that's so beautiful. And I think it is a part of the Christian movement, right, that we've lost that, is so, important. And I'm grateful for people like yourself and people, our ancestors, right, that remind us that are, are close to the ground. They're not, there's no way of living spirituality individually, right? You can't, it's impossible. And, speaking of, you mentioned like not separating the work you do, right, of social justice and spirituality. And obviously I know the work you're doing and so grateful to get to collaborate in some of it. But can you share what work are you currently involved in now, and like how do you occupy your time? And
Sure. So right now I'm co-leading along with another folks on Puentes Collective. So Puentes Collective is a space for BIPOC, mainly Latinx, millennials and younger generations of social activists and spiritual activists or spiritual folks. And the work has been really special and meaningful to me because it feels like it's a space that I wish I had when I started doing this activism work. In my 20s. And so I see myself a lot reflected in learning from a lot of the young folks that come into these retreats and into these cohorts of like communities of practice. And the reason this Puentes Collective came about was actually in 2018 and 2019, doing border work with Matthew 25, which is my day job, Matthew 25 SoCal, in doing these pilgrimages to the San Diego-Tijuana border when the exodus of the Central American, but also the Haitian political asylum seekers were coming, right, and overwhelming, right, saturating the border, particularly in Tijuana, and all of the things that, that happen in border cities where a lot of rejection, a lot of violence, a lot of danger, but also, a lot of welcoming from, the things that don't get publicized in the media as much. And so we did these trips and bringing, mostly Christian churches to the border with other Christian churches at the border in Tijuana that were housing or providing a meal or providing supplies to asylum seekers from Central America and Haiti. But we noticed that there was a lot of burnout. There was a lot of political and a lot of like patronizing and a lot of the white churches, just throwing money at things, as long as it got done their way, right? And so having also the churches at the border having to comply just so that they could get something, right? And so with all of us who were like Chicanos and like migrants ourselves that had grown up in the United States and, and even people that were brown, but like, Boricuas, so like they didn't even have a concept of what being a migrant was in another context, but they got treated like migrants. My body actually physically broke down in 2018 because of the stress and because of the trauma, having had family at the border being deported and going through places where, just having all of these memories and all of this trauma relived. That was very difficult for me. So I couldn't cross the third day. I was crossing people over. And mind you, I'm also like not a U.S. citizen yet. I have a green card. So being careful about, how I did things and who I did things with. And, right. And having some people with like their Caucasianness, put my life in danger and the life of other people in danger, with them not understanding. Right. And so I remember the reason in 2019 when we did this trip with 100 people, over 100 people that we crossed over, and we did it in pairs. A few of them broke down as well, right? So again, my experience wasn't isolated. We had some Central American folks who, just hearing the racist rhetoric and the xenophobic rhetoric from Mexicans themselves, right? And understanding, like, I understand why you're saying this, and you're internalizing your oppression, you're internalizing your racism, but there was no space for puentes, what were called, like a bridge. Right. Between the United States and Mexico, and the bridge between the church and living in these liminal spaces. And so we had a lot of practice, and we created this guideline on what we could do as Puentes and how do we hold this space. But there wasn't a lot of curriculum or a lot of space of like what happens when you get triggered, because you will be triggered, right? We're not these like naive, young people that are like, oh, Pueblo de Dios, and let's just join hands. Like, no, the Pueblo de Dios is messy as fuck,
Calling out the BS,
we bring. Yeah, right. We're messy. We say inappropriate things. We act, with our agendas before we think about the community, and yeah, we actually got some grant money from Sandra Bonafso, which I'm gonna just give her a shout out. Sandra Bonafso and Mark Reddy, who really invested and really saw us and saw our pain, right? And so we created our first retreat, and it was mostly for there were about 10 of us that went to the border and other folks that couldn't go, but were connected to the work. And we just basically had it was this session of opening up ourselves, of talking about what the experience was like, but also where the church needed to be better, right? And what kind of space did we need that wasn't just the church, because a lot of us had been hurt by the church. And so we wanted to continue doing the work, and we knew we were called to our spiritual work, but the church didn't quite have the space for it, and activism didn't quite have the space for it, right? So we created Puentes, right? We were that in-between space where a lot of people call it tension, where tension isn't held. And I don't see it as tension, right? Even like when my friends that are Chicanos, they'll talk about like, ni de aquí ni de allá. And I was like, I never saw myself that way. I belong everywhere.
Right.
Where the earth is made for us to care for it, to respect it, and to be where we need to be. Right. And so I always felt like, no, we live in this space as Puentes, and it's not for people to walk over you. So I did all this research about like what bridges were. And everybody always, when we talked about puentes, they're like, no, it's like this very man-made structure, and people walk over you. So you got to have the resistance, right? Like the resilience to be walked over. And I was like, fuck that. No, that's not what that is. I'm like, that is not what I think about. I feel like I'm bridging gaps.
Yes.
I feel like a puente is, where there was a grieta, or there was like something broke that wasn't broken. And so we just got to make a way for it. Right. And I did, in my research, I found like these TED Talks about like how nature creates these bridges, right? So how like trees talk to each other and the like roots,
right?
And it's so important, right? Like the roots of the bridges, right? The roots start to interweave and start to collaborate and start to make these bridges that withstand storms, that withstand waters, right? So like it goes over the waters, and people are able to get and do whatever they got to do, and they live separately, but at some point they come together. And I was like, okay, this is what I want people to know that are part of Puentes Collective. Like, you live in this in-betweenness, and you've been told that you're alienated, or you've been told that you're like a rarito or a rarita, but you're not. Like, you've been meant for this, right? And it's not about how like men make structures where you have your curriculum and you have and this is like how you respond to somebody being like, no, you find each other and the roots. And for me, that was so important, is that the roots, right? So we don't know where we're going to go if we don't know where we come from. So a lot of the focus on Puentes has been on ancestral healing and has been on ancestral collection, right? So I don't know if you remember when we did the Yo Libero poem, right? It was a Nahuatl, it was a Nahuatl blessing, right? And it was talking about liberation, right? And liberating ourselves from our need to please other people's dreams, right? To fulfill the desires of and like, as even like migrants in the United States, and we're like the generation that gets to go to college and actually finish, or like gets to go to seminary and actually be ordained, like through these systems that are also full of shit. Right. But like, you just need that piece of paper to validate something that your ancestors have been telling you, you were meant to be for, and that you were created for. And so for me, it's like, go get that college degree, go get that 6-figure job, do what you got to do. But that is not who you are. It is not all of it. It doesn't define you, right? Yes. So if we don't know where we come from and are rooted into where our ancestors, have survived, and that we are here because they resisted, because they weren't exterminated. They didn't allow their extermination, and that's why we're here, right? Even though we're mixed with like European and colonizer blood, and we recognize that, but the piece of ourselves that has been denied out of protection, sometimes even from our own family, right? Like we don't know where like the Black family members come from, the ones that didn't speak Spanish in Mexico because they spoke, an indigenous language, but nobody ever like talked about like, oh, that was Nahuatl or that was Tarasco. Nobody talked about it, right? And I feel like we have the privilege and the opportunity to unearth that and to remember that and bring that back and bring our ancestors back, and to also not shame our families' instinct for survival.
Right.
That maybe they had to deny those parts of themselves in order to survive. Maybe it wasn't the only choice. Right. But, like that prayer in Your Libero says, that I'm not going to blame my parents and I'm not going to blame, they did the best with what they had and how they could. Right. And even if they could have done better, it's done. Right. But I'm liberating. Right. So the 7th generation before me, so that the 7 generations after me, right, are going to like not have to deal with these things and not have to be in therapy for like 15 years like I've been. Right? Like that'll just be, we'll talk about our feelings and it'll be fine. We'll talk about how we, are not okay with certain family traditions that are actually hurtful, particularly for women. Right. And I feel like Puentes Collective does that, right? And it's that space, and that we still want to involve the church and we still want to involve justice spaces, but that there has to be a place where we heal. We can't just be about the work. We can't, and again, right? Like I can't just be about church and I can't just be about the justice work. I am me. And even if I didn't have that and if I didn't have the other, I'm still me. But if I don't know who I am and I'm only allowing myself to be defined through my religion or through my activism, then, that's going to be very difficult for me. And I've experienced it, right? And it's not because I'm speaking out of theory. I've lived it. I lived it and I survived, but there were people within those 2 camps that came because they saw me. And before I couldn't even see myself. And so that for me was a blessing. And that's the space that, I'm trying to create because, again, I'm not doing this just to benefit me. I love it. I love having the retreats and I love doing the spiritual work and this activist work. But I know that if I've been through some of this stuff, I know that others have. And so I want to hold the space and I want to do it in a way that I wish it would have been done to me. Right. Definitely. So I'm like remembering that for them.
No, love that. That's such a really, I think, helpful and beautiful description, of the work. And, you said a lot of things that, give a lot of great visuals, like the puente. Like I never thought about it that way of like to be walked on, I always thought about it in a more kind of like healing space too. And I think it's because of also the healing that I've been able to do over the years, right? Of, of course, through white supremacy, through, poverty, through different ways on which, my family struggled, and I struggled, it definitely, made life difficult, right? And, this healing that is necessary to happen individually. It's also what I'm hearing you say, it's also can only happen in community, right? And when we see each other together. And I'm so grateful for your leadership in putting this together for many of us, mostly out here in Southern California, right? And on this part, but, nowadays we're connected all over the world too, especially through technology. But I just want to acknowledge you and thank you for all the work that you put into the Puentes Collective. Where could people find, like if they want to get connected, want to give people the opportunity to, where can they find this?
Sure. So we just launched our website a couple months ago. We have very basic information because we're still building as we go, building the plane as we go, as Alexa says. Yes. But puentescollective.org. That is our website, and you can find out a little bit about who we are, what we do. We have some videos up now, and we'll be putting up more information. And you can find us also on Instagram through Puentes Collective as well, and Facebook for those of us who are older, Chavorruco generations. But yeah, it's definitely been a labor of love, and it's been a labor of many people, right? And honoring our elders. It's a lot of us are under 40. But the work and the wisdom, we have a wise council as well that we're still building of BIPOC elders. And I know I get this question also a lot, of like, this space is exclusively for Black, Indigenous people of color, for the reason that a lot of us, whenever we are thrown into diverse spaces, it means that we center the white experience. And I wanted this to be different. There are folks who are BIPOC who are also mixed, so we recognize that, right? Or who are also white, but their experience has been more through the lens of a BIPOC community, and their struggle and right lucha for like that, remembering that part of themselves that they were not allowed to. In their past experience. So it's definitely, but we'll take everybody's money. That's not a problem. We'll take everyone's money to do this work. Reparations. And that liberation, right? Yes. The liberation work is, I don't have to be in the space in order to also participate in liberation. I myself have been, thought a lot about that during the Black Lives Matter rallies and conversations, where I felt like I'm just gonna send a check, I'm just gonna, Venmo someone, and I don't gotta be part of it, and they don't have to tell me what they're doing with that money. Yeah. Like, I just gotta trust that my community knows what to do and be a good steward. And I also want to encourage people of color, when you give, I want to give to these legitimate, organizations. Yes. It's like a lot of us start with a little dream, and with like all the money that we use is used to like buy postage and buy a book, that we don't want to have to think a college student, can buy a book of whatever we're reflecting on. Like, we want to cover that because we know that, you're already giving up a lot of your time, and that's also like monetary compensation. Right. So if you want to find out more, there's a newsletter you can sign up for, and we'll be sending more information.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, so excited to be a part of this with you. And again, thankful for your leadership. And I'm curious, like, you shared a little bit about your experience growing up, and like, how did you get connected? Like, you kind of answered that question already, but can more specifically, especially for folks that like maybe they're going through these processes, right? Like, everybody's experience is different, but for folks that are maybe like feeling like, I don't know what to do with all these things, like, what was your experience like? Maybe you could share some wisdom.
Sure. I started my activism work, through church, through missions. I didn't, go to like this radical like work. I did stuff in high school, with like a Chicano club, and again, right, it was just different experiences. And I think I came to this work when I just felt, I think what my advice for somebody who's like, you're at this crux or at this fork road of, feeling burned out, but also having like this desire in your heart and you want things to be different, to venture out and like trust yourself. And I think for me, like, just as a brown woman, I didn't always trust my instinct, or I was, if your chanclas are not aligned, if your chakras are not aligned, or your life isn't aligned with your purpose, or, we're grabbing at everything, the thing that's exciting, that for me, the thing that has been the most difficult for me has been the thing that has fed me the most, like that I need to be in, as long as it doesn't traumatize me. So don't stay in a job where you're constantly being traumatized, right? Where you're constantly may feel like your work doesn't matter, or that, or that it has no relevance. But if you're struggling because you see how things can be better, and you see that you do have some influence, or you're able to do something, even if it's in accounting, even if it's a 9-to-5 job, or you're doing ministry and like, somebody's getting paid way more, and you just started and you have all this seminary debt, or you're an activist, where maybe your activist space has no space for spirituality, where like that just seems to be something that nobody cares about, you can still be, again, like water, right? Be fluid, you can still be fed, and not one space is going to feed all of your needs, just like not one person fulfills all of your needs. You will have these different communities, and then your journey and whatever it is, whatever unlearning and relearning that you're doing in yourself, the universe will just conspire against you. and so not against you, with you.
Yes.
And you will be able to do this. But I think that also takes a lot of centering. It takes a lot of, for my own experience, there's a lot of self-medication that we do as young people, sometimes where, we secretly, even if you're clergy, you may be, drinking or smoking or doing some things, right? We got to get real here, right? Or there may be some people in your life that you're getting, emotionally and sexually involved with that are not, that are just not allowing you to grow. And so to take that introspective look into your life and saying is this person, is this substance, is this thing serving me, and is it serving my purpose, right? And if the answer is no, then your next question to yourself is, then, where do I need to go? Or where are the things that maybe have been speaking to me that I've been ignoring? Because I feel like none of the things that have happened in my life and how I came into this work was because I was at home doing nothing, right? I was still sitting in the church pew, being upset about all the misogyny being spewed, or I try to put something on in a community for my church, and, I knew that the board was against me, but there's always that one person. There's always, it's not a lot of people. And the thing is, when you're at your lowest, you don't have a lot of people cheering you on. But the people who are consistent, who are not draining you, that you actually feel uplifted, even if they exchange a couple of words with you, those are the people that I feel the universe, right, sends you. And sometimes a lot of it is dealing with our own stuff and being honest. And for me, I had to be honest and say, I love activism. I love my faith. Whatever's happening right now isn't working. And so a lot of it, we expect the answers to come from the outside, and they're all in here, right? Yo también me hacía pendeja. And I wanted to lie to myself, pretend it wasn't hurting me, or pretend that I was okay, and so therapy absolutely worked. Having people who could spiritual counsel you, and they don't have to be elders. A lot of my best, what I'm unlearning about mentorship is that I have a lot of young people that mentor me, and they don't see it themselves. And when I say that, they don't like it, but it's true.
Yes.
A lot of young people are mentoring me, and especially the way they are and the way they view social issues, right? Things that at their age, I wasn't even at the level they're at. And so there's a lot to learn from them. There's a lot to learn from my elders because they've also lived it, So I feel like you learn to discern. And for me, it was at my points where I just wanted to give up and throw in the towel, and I'm just going to do a berrinche, and I'm just going to go get a 9 to 5 and get that money. And I did that for a little bit, and I tried to get that money, and it was burning me out, and it wasn't worth it, And so it's also for me, as long as I'm able to, one of my really good friends says, never unlearn how to eat frijoles and arroz, right? If you got beans and rice at home, and you got a roof over your head, and you got people that love you and support you, you got it all, And so I always feel okay, so sometimes you're going to be able to eat pozole and carne asada, but not all the time, and that's okay.
I'm all about that morisqueta, It's like you got that right there.
Happy.
Exactly. No, thank you. This is, so encouraging. I personally find it encouraging. I know other people too, especially people that are going through it, right? And I'm curious, you mentioned going after that 9 to 5, I can't even imagine you doing that, knowing you, because, I've known you for years now, but maybe sometimes that is necessary, right? We all have our different experiences and whatnot. So for people hearing this, don't hear it you got to be doing your, dream job always, right? Because it's hard too, right? And I'm curious if you want to say a little bit about that, how that has been, being an entrepreneur, right? Not just going after the big bucks, but doing what you really feel called to do, other words of wisdom to share of believing in yourself and going after this. I would love if you could share some, please.
Sure. No, thank you for bringing that up. I did, and being undocumented, right? It's not like I had a lot of opportunities in my early 20s to just pick whatever job I wanted, right? Yeah. But I knew how to work hard. But I also learned the one things that my parents have always taught me has been working hard. But again, right, we're breaking also a lot of generational stuff that doesn't serve us. Where I'm going to work hard right now. because I'm not always going to have the strength physically. I'm not always, right? And I did a 9 to 5. I mean, I worked corporate for a long time. That's where I learned sales. That's where I learned how to use that spreadsheet, right? So there's like some stuff that I still use today that were very helpful. Right. The corporate, environment was a little toxic. You had to deal with a lot of racism, but who doesn't, right? We're in the United States of America. We're all going to deal with racism at one point in our lives. But we're also working towards dismantling it. So I'm also, I look forward to the day we don't have to deal with that anymore. Right. Maybe my children's children time. But yeah, I felt like I felt proud of my work. I always left, I've always been a person like, if I'm going to do something, I'm going to half-ass it. I'm going to do it right. Even if I don't like it, even if it's grunt work, right, I'm going to do it. But there's always, again, right, that's why I talk also about the spaces and communities, that your work shouldn't be your satisfaction. So if you don't have your dream job, it's also a capitalistic mindset to think that you got to do what you love all the time. Because I don't always wake up loving myself all the time. You just got to work on loving me, right? So sometimes you just got to wake up and learn to love your 9 to 5. That's paying your bills. So be grateful that at least it pays your bills. But, but there are communities. There's writing circles, right? If writing is your thing, there's also, if you like to do sports, if you like things that you do on your off time that are like hobbies, and your hobby can become the thing that later on in life, in whatever season you find yourself into, will actually be the thing that pays your bills, right? And so for me, I didn't grow up always where church was everything. I worked for church for a while and I loved it. And I ended up not really loving church because I started working with that one. Yeah. I was like, oh shit, okay. And so, but I feel like that was a season where I needed to be there. I made a difference there. Other people in that space, whether corporate or a religious setting, or a justice setting. For me, it's always find the lesson, but also find the things where you're like, yeah, that definitely doesn't serve me. And maybe that's not a space that I should be in anymore or right now. And I think that makes it difficult, especially during this pandemic, right? Where like job security isn't something that people are guaranteed. But for me, it's like unlearning this capitalistic mindset of saying like, what makes you happy? What are you happy with? You may have a 6-figure salary, but then that means more debt. That means you don't even know how to like administer your money, right? So I've been reading, Decolonizing Wealth, right? With, Edgar Villaseñor, right? And so like even the concept of like, as minorities, we're not taught, we're taught to fear money or to love it. We're not taught to like, it's a tool. It's just something that's going to help me get somewhere, but it's a tool. So then I get to shape my tool. I get to dictate what it does. I don't get to let it dictate how my life should be. And I think for people that are finding themselves through like their career or a lack of fulfillment, for me, it's like, I look at the rest of my life. Is it just my job? Because it could be very real. Right. Or is it just other things that are shifting in my life, in my family, in the people around me, in my friendships, that are maybe draining me and not allowing me to do my job? Right. And that's very real, especially when we talk about family, when you are the one that went to college and that broke a lot of barriers and did a lot of firsts, that's been my experience. And so I would leave other things, that fulfill me just so that I could take care of my family. Right. And so like now that I think about this poem, The Blessing of Yo Libero, and I'm like, I got to liberate myself from the need to like parent my parents or to parent my siblings. Right. And I'm learning, to parent myself and to mother myself, where I'm grateful for the things my parents did for me. But I know there were things where they fell short. Right. And so I gotta be that for me, right? I gotta mother myself. I gotta parent myself, and maybe be that wasn't fulfilled, and still not hold them. Like it's not their fault. Yes, they did what they could, right? It's not their fault, but now it's my responsibility with this knowledge that I have to actually do something about it, right? And so 15 years of therapy will do that for you also. Yes, that introspection.
No, and thank you for sharing that. Like not everybody's comfortable sharing, talking about these things, but like I so resonate with that, in that poem, that's definitely why I've gone to therapy, the same thing, that loneliness and the like pain of parenting your parents. And like, I still to this day struggle with that kind of stuff. And, I appreciate you sharing it, because I think, sometimes we don't talk about these things. Right. And and especially for people like us. Obviously, we're not the same, but we have similar experiences, and definitely I appreciate you being real and like saying how real therapy is, and like it is so necessary, to do and helpful, and I'm thankful for the therapists out there, right? Especially these days. Mental health is key, and it's holistic, right? Like we talk about it, like it's this thing that's just in our brains, but I love how you talk about it too, and being connected to our ancestors and remembering, and it really is connected to all of creation, of how we have been so fragmented and disconnected, from healing, I think this is probably a good segue to talk about this book project that you're working on. Can you share a little bit more, please? I'm so excited. I got to hear a little bit about it earlier.
Yes, no, thank you for that. Thank you for bringing that up. So as I was sharing with you offline, I was talking about writing and how like Eurocentric it is, right? And like this concept of like style and all of these things. But, the quote that just like kept bringing up in my head, when I was talking about friends that have been writing books, Alma Cardenas Rodriguez has been somebody who inspired me, to actually say yes to it. And when she published Groanings from the Desert, right? And it's just a collection of like poetry and bilingual stuff, and Christy Robinson, who also wrote Hermanas, co-author with Karen Gonzalez and other folks, just all of these like also brown women writers that for me, I just thought that's great. I just don't have the time to do it, right? And then finally, I was just like self-sabotaging, right? Like you make the time, right? And because there's this quote by like Ricky Sherover Marcuse, that talks about assume that you are the expert on your own experience and that you have information which other people need to hear. And for me, it was like, I talk a lot, me. I don't have a problem talking, but like to sit down and process, I went through, when I decided I'm going to write something, it wasn't anything new. It's been writings for like over 10 years that I've been writing about, And so I thought, I think I'm going to do this, and it's just been work, poetry, frustration prayers, dream. I'm huge about dream interpretation, especially now that I'm tapping more into my indigenous spirituality and my roots. Like all of these meanings, and that these dreams that I wrote 10 years ago, 11 years ago, are revealing themselves to me now in a more deeper way than before. And so for me, this book is that, and this book is intentionally bilingual and Spanglish, right? For that reason that I'm like, fuck your writing style. Like I'm going to write in a way like my voice is going to come through, right? And it's my experience, right?
Yes.
So to go back to Ricky's quote, it's like, it's my own experience, and I am the expert of my own. Nobody gets to tell my story. So instead of other people trying to tell my story about who I am, why don't I just put it in writing, and I always talk about it through our retreats and the work we do with Puentes. And again, right, that's a different way. Oral traditions in our collective cultures are sacred, and they're important, and they're here to stay. They ain't going nowhere.
Right.
But there's also something about writing and about putting something on paper that does, like you mentioned earlier, it gets immortalized, right? And it's a reminder for me also, other people share my experience. And maybe they don't feel that they could, right? And if it wasn't for these brown women, right? If it wasn't for like Alma, if it wasn't for Karen, if it wasn't for Christy, right? Like to say, maybe I should. Maybe this is something that I should do. And also taking from, some of their experiences where some of their publishing experiences weren't so great, right? And so for me, it's like, how do I do it in a way that it's not just about the art, but the entire process of this book? And so, my book is, I'm writing about just me being me, right? The messy me, the spiritual me, also like, the broken me, but also the healed me, right? Because that's all of us. So it's definitely not telling people how to live their life or how to make all these steps for everything. It's just like, this is the stuff I went through. Hope you relate. and but like we ain't going nowhere, and we're here, and it's fine.
Yes.
And it's in a language that I see this more and more, like bilingualism and and Spanglish and being, again, right, like those of us who live in the United States from like that speak still the colonizer language of English and Spanish. We have like our own language too.
Exactly.
We have our own way and our own voice. And I see it's exciting for me to hear those voices and see them in the media, see them in print, see them in, on social media, because this is who we are and this is how our generation is, and it needs to be captured. And so that's what inspired me. People that are doing activism and faith and are also just through all of that living life.
Yes. No, I'm so excited for it to come out and yeah, to learn from it, to be inspired by it, to share it with others, right, in comunidad, and you mentioned that you probably have 2 books, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, and you start with one, right? And it's like one of those things. You're like, oh, maybe the other one. Yes. And actually, my inspiration for this book of recipes and stories of my ancestors, was actually inspired by Edith Woodley. And, we were talking about she was talking about badass grandmas, and thought of like my abuelita who raised me, right? And I still cook, a lot of her recipes. I cook things, I modify them, obviously, right, to like my way, what I have available with me. But, especially during this pandemic times, my grandma's in her 70s. I don't know how much longer she's going to be around. And, I wanted to do something to honor her. And again, right, like I will honor her through the oral traditions and through her cooking. But, fortunately, I got this grant where I'm going to be able to travel back, home and do some stuff with her and cook. And that's always been, my memories of childhood memories. My grandma was a cook. She was a caterer. And among her many other jobs, she was a todóloga. She did a little bit of todo. And, but I remember the metate, and like her, grinding corn and grinding beans and, molcajetes, where she would make the salsas, and she had these huge clay pots, and she made like very like Mesoamerican, like enchiladas and pozole. We had an outdoor kitchen. So she would like, I mean, you would never taste pozole the same way, it's like from a wood fire. But for me, it's like, these are the stories and the recipes, right, that get to be immortalized and that I get to honor her through. But there's also like the story, right? And so hopefully I'll be able to, I don't know how I'm going to do it yet, but I'll be able to maybe do some video and maybe do, just take advantage of the things and the technology that we have, so that I get to enjoy those memories, but then I get to share it with the rest of my community. Yes. So that one will probably be faster than my other one. I feel like my personal stuff I'm always going to be more picky about. Yes. So that probably will be ready for my 40th birthday. I've been joking with some friends and been saying, when I enter into like my full señora stage, that's when I'm able to. So I feel like 40 for me is my señora. Like I was born to be a señora, like my señora stage. And then I can like just talk shit and be like, tell me what to do. So I'm hoping, right, and like the young me, and how I appreciate and hold her, and how she kept me together even when she didn't have it together. So it's also good to travel back in time and to have other younger people, see that like it'll be okay. We're gonna be okay.
Definitely. Well, can't wait for both of these books and everything else, that's developed. And I'm so glad you mentioned like getting videos, because I was totally thinking like that's got to be documented, like obviously through all the means that we have, right, through technology. And so I can't wait to check out both of these and continue to learn from them and for you to get to share them with others. And speaking of, shout out to another colega, who's the colega in this podcast, Kat Armas, who's also, in her book, Abuelita Faith, right? And totally kind of reminds me of this idea, right, of learning from our abuelitas. And, I love that idea of the embodiment, right, of food and how sacred it is, especially in the Mesoamerican culture, right? It really is, things like maize and there's so much sacredness in the earth and in the fruits of the earth that I can't wait to I'm salivating and excited, and yeah, thank you for doing that and for this time today. I want to be mindful of your time and kind of conclude here with some of the rapid fire questions where we ask everybody who joins us here. So as we kind of wrap up, one question is, if you could have, speaking of food, right? If you could have a dinner party with 5 people, it doesn't have to be 5, but no more than 5, people that passed on already or people that are here still, who would they be and why?
Oh, that's a good question. Definitely Audre Lorde. Yeah, she's so inspired by her work in the past few years for me.
Yes.
Yeah, she's just a force to be reckoned with, way ahead of her time.
Yes.
Way ahead of her time. I was to say James Baldwin. Love his poetry and his vulnerability. Yeah, just people like Nina Simone. Because I've been listening to, Nina Simone, just as a singer, and then just her own struggle and her own humanity, like with herself, but also like how strong she was and how feminine she was, and she didn't care. Anthony Bourdain talking about food, and I'm still feeling just his loss, and like the complicated person that he was, but
yes.
He always put, especially women chef and all the abuelitas, and all of like the humble food that was like the best food with simplicity, but with a lot of love. Oh my goodness. Who else?
And that would be an amazing party so far.
Yeah, and I would probably think like Sandra Cisneros. I feel like Sandra Cisneros is a writer, as somebody who like grew up in the United States and like talked about her Chicano, just upbringing, and like, the House of Mango Street was something that I read in 10th grade, and to this day, like I still remember, just who she was as just such a like revolucionaria also, in her writing, and the imagery, like I'll never get that off my mind, the imagery in her writing. Yeah.
That would be incredible. That party would be lit for sure.
Oh yeah.
And so as we're getting started with this podcast, would you have any recommendations, a person that you think would be good, to share their story through this podcast?
Oh, well, I mean, and I'm biased because this morning I had a cranial session with Alina Ortiz Salvatierra.
Yes.
But I feel she's like this elder who's not an elder, for me, who's way younger than me, but that I learned so much as a healer and as somebody who's like honoring her ancestry, right? As a mixed person, and just her love for her community and for holistic health. She definitely calms me down, and she also happens to be, Alexia Salvatierra's daughter. But yes. I feel like they're different type of healers, definitely, each in their own, obviously their own craft, being perfected and being amazing. But yeah, I think there's somebody you want to talk about healing and about being in your body. She always talks a lot, and I've like left my body for so long out of protection for all my trauma and all the stuff that happened, and I feel like she's a person that like feels safe to be back in my body in, and so you should definitely have her on.
Thank you. No, definitely, I would love to have Alina. Definitely appreciate that recommendation. Totally thinking the same thing. And so, closing out here, how would you define refuge?
That's a good question. I would define refuge as a place where you were meant to be. I feel as a place where maybe, some people look for refuge out of their busyness, and some people look for refuge out of the violence and the threat to their person. And so for me, I think when I think of refuge is the space, and it doesn't have to be physical, but the space, within ourselves or within our community, or physical also, where not only are we safe, but we are allowed to be who we're meant to be.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Love that so much. Vane, this has been such a gift and joy. I know time went by fast, And, hopefully this is not the last time we get to do this together. I know we get to collaborate in a lot of other ways, but really, gracias. I appreciate you sharing a little bit about your story and for others to get to hear this. So, adelante. Thank you.
Gracias.
Oh my goodness, Josh, this was such a fun conversation to
Yes.
sort of eavesdrop into and listen to and reflect on, because I feel like Vane and I just have so many connecting points. I need to like totally reach out to her and like talk about all of these things all over again, because I felt like I was so connected with her and resonated with so much of what she was sharing, particularly about just her wisdom and insight and her passion about reconnecting with her ancestors. I feel like that's been such a huge part of my journey and my writing and my work, is really just looking backwards and sort of making sense of who I am and making sense of my spirituality, making sense of my cultural identity, making sense of everything, right? Of who I am as a woman. And so I love that, that she really emphasizes this notion of remember. And that's something, that I love writing about, particularly, and this is something that I think is so interesting when we talk about decolonization, right? Because essentially what we're doing is decolonizing. It's something that's like so biblical, which is funny because, so many of the people who are very committed to the Bible in a way that is not very life-giving for many of us, they would not see this as something that is right. They would not see decolonization as something that is biblical. But if you read all throughout the Bible, I mean, literally God is like, remember your ancestors, remember where you came from, remember who you are. And you see that the Israelites are so deeply committed to remembering who they came from, right? Remembering their customs, remembering their traditions, remembering their people, and remembering, their people's faith, right? I think that's such a cool thing that we see, like even in the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, it's all about the faith of the ancestors, right? Like what kind of faith did they have and how did they live out that faith? And so faith is something that it's not just like, oh, I formulate this faith in my present here and now, but faith is something that I'm constantly looking backwards and that I'm constantly like, bringing in just traditions and things that have shaped me, things that I might not even know, right? And I like how she words that. She says that something about how her ancestors are putting her back into her body that felt so, disconnected and I love that, right? Like without us even consciously knowing, us doing the work of remembering is putting us back into ourselves, right? And so I just love that. I thought that was so powerful because it's something that, the journey that I've been on, in the last several years. So that was really good. What did you think?
Yeah, no, definitely. I so, resonated with, the conversation with her, but also, it reminds me of the book that you wrote, right? In a lot of ways, like you're saying, there's so many overlaps in terms of, I think decolonizing our spirituality, especially Christianity, but also like the ways in which it is very bodily, right? It's reminding us. And so speaking of remembering, like, I totally think that the conversation reminded me so much of your book. And, I just wanted to ask you if you could share maybe some particular parts from your book, Abuelita Faith, that, kind of stood out to you from the conversation with Vane.
Yeah, so much, which I really appreciated. I felt like we were certainly kinfolk, in this journey. But so there were a couple of things that stood out to me. One, I loved how obviously she talks about her abuela, and how her abuela shaped so much of who she is. But also I think in that there's a complexity in that, right? There's a complexity in loving and being raised and honoring, those who came before us, but also how many of their circumstances or situations weren't ideal. And therefore, there are many things that were passed on to us that may have been harmful, or things that were passed on to us that, were not helpful, and things that we're trying to heal and let go of, right? And so I think of, when I think of, our abuelitas in general, the times that they were raised in, and she brings this up too, right? That she was pregnant and she had like 11 children, and that's just what it was, right? She worked and raised children, and she didn't have the luxury to do anything else, right? And I think the same thing about my abuela, right? That there was so much that she succumbed to because of the culture, because of how Vane puts it, institutionalized religion, because my abuela was Catholic as well. And, so there's so many things that I feel like our abuelas lived through that they passed on to us, right? With the best intentions. But like, again, machismo, right? That has to do with the whole raising children, all of these things that were passed on to us that we're sort of rejecting now, but we're still informed by, and we still look back with fondness and love. And so I think that that's the complexity of, at the end of the day, just survival, right? Survival is complicated, right? There is no, it's not neat and cute and pretty. It's messy. And that's something that I do talk about in Our Faith, is just that survival is complicated and it's messy. And sometimes it looks how we don't want it to look.
Right.
But that's just the reality of the matter. Right. And so, so it's our job now, as Vanessa says, to kind of let go of what doesn't serve us and hold on to what does. And I think that is sort of the essence of an abuelita faith, right? And then the next thing that I really resonated with, that also I feel like speaks to abuelita faith, is how she mentions, this idea that she's not, she's ni de aquí ni de allá, or that we talk about generally that we're neither ni de aquí ni de allá.
Right.
But she was like, no, like that doesn't, that doesn't speak to me. She's like, I'm from everywhere, and I really love that, because in abuelita faith, I do mention, like, well, what if we reclaim that and we weren't ni de aquí ni de allá, but what if we reclaim that we're like both de aquí y de allá, right?
Yes.
That we're both from here and from there, because we don't need to be either or. In a colonial society, everything is binary, and you have to, be here or there, or no, I'm from here and there, and I'm both and I'm messy and I'm complicated, just like survival, right?
Yes.
Because that is what was passed on to me, this notion of survival, which is messy. Therefore, I am messy. So I really appreciated that she mentioned those things.
Yes, 100%. And like, definitely, like, I think you and I have talked about this in the past too, just of, reclaiming that, right? And again, grateful for your book where you write about this. And I just think like it so resonates with our generation and other generations too, right? That, we have been put in this box of, feeling like we don't fit in here, we don't fit in there, right? And, it is a gift to see, like, with new eyes, that this is, this is the hybridity, right? It reminds me too of, Robert Romero in his book, The Brown Church. He talks about la raza cósmica, right? Like the cosmic race is this like hybridity of all these beautiful different parts of the world coming together. And, I'm so grateful too for Vanessa, her leadership. She's really the one that kind of spearheaded this group that she mentioned in the podcast, the Puentes Collective, that is really bringing a lot of us, mostly in Southern California, but, people across the country too, and across the world, through technology, doing this ancestral healing, doing this kind of like reclaiming that you mentioned, and really like, I think it's so necessary, right? So grateful for that group, that is really like looking at the ancestral wisdom and the healing and the real like gifts that we have, to aid us along the survival, right? Because that's what life is. Right. It's, we've talked about Anda Maria Isasi Diaz, right? La lucha, right? She always talks about that. That's what life was all about. It was always like, and that's, it's the ongoing struggle. And, she mentioned this part also about like calling and capitalism, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on some of what she shared about that too.
Yeah. So I thought that was really good too, because it's also something that I referenced, in my work. Yeah. It's this idea that, and she mentions like, we have to, like, it's a capitalist mindset that to think that we have to love everything that, our job, or like love or feel, and that's something that it is true. That is a very recent thing, in privileged societies and Western culture, that you feel like you have to be super passionate, and like wake up every morning with purpose. And of course that's wonderful. Like I want to feel that way. I'm not like, I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but it is a newer concept. Our ancestors, they didn't wake up and think like, I'm so passionate about my work, in the land. I mean, maybe they were, but it was just work, right? You're trying to eat, like you're trying to feed your children,
La
like
lucha,
you're just
right?
trying to like, right. So I really love that, that she kind of mentioned and I also, in Abuelita Faith, I mentioned how for many marginalized people, again, their calling is survival. And Patrick Reyes talks about this in his book as well. That's sort of where I began ruminating with this idea of like, we don't necessarily have in our communities, there isn't this overarching sense of calling. You work, right? And in that work, and that's why in Abuelita Faith, I argue that it is the survival that is in and of itself holy. So that survival, that day in and day out, that struggle, that lucha, that's holy, right? Like, it doesn't need to be a calling of like, oh, I'm working, no, I'm surviving, and that is sacred, right, in and of itself. And so I really love that. And also you mentioned the puentes, and I wanted to say something more about that, speaking of puentes and bridges.
Yes.
Another thing that I really loved that she mentioned was, and it goes back to this thing, this theme that we're kind of talking about, this reclaiming. She's reclaiming, right, this notion of bridge. And I feel like she's right. We talk about bridge, or a lot of folks talk about bridges, and as something man-made, as she says, or as something that, you walk on a bridge, like people walk all over, like my bridge is my back, right? Like Ansaldúa talks about, like, the bridge is my back. But I love that she's like, well, no, bridges are not always man-made. In fact, nature creates bridges. That's what essentially roots are for. Like, roots act as bridges. They act between trees. And it's so funny because in my upcoming devotional, like, I have a whole section on this, like a whole devotional on how like nature literally communicates. So I felt even, I'm telling you, like, even from my first book to this book, I'm like, yes. But yeah, like, nature in and of itself creates bridges and communicates. And, and she talks about how like a bridge is something that, she wants to create bridges, because something was broken, and she wants to, bring two things that were essentially broken back together. And I just love that reclamation. And I think that, that's what we, as a collective people, as Latinos, Latinas, as folks of color are trying to do, as we seek out our own liberation and the liberation of our people. We're trying to reclaim a lot of what I feel like is essentially liberating, but has been co-opted by white supremacy and colonialism, and has made it something, like a bridge, right? It doesn't have to be man-made. In fact, bridges are part of the land and nature. And so, I thought that was so good. I don't know if you have any, final thoughts on that.
No, I'm just smiling here because I'm excited to get a little sneak peek of your next book, the devotional book. So thank you for that. And thank you for, all of this, like, really, it so resonates. And just the last one thing real quick, like, as you were saying that about, puentes, about bridges, about like, just resonating and remembering recent conversations that I've had with other, like, obviously, you and I, we're from the Latino, Latinx, Latini, community, right? And like, this is something huge in our community, of, especially for, first generation, second generation, this, like, the pain, right, in the trauma of like being torn from our lands and being in between these, man-made borders, right? These human-made borders that don't exist, really, if we believe God's world is,
right. Yeah.
Creation. When all these nationalistic, geopolitical borders they're just human-made, and
right.
Most importantly, I think even more deeper than those borders on a map are the borders, I think, in our brain, that are entrenched, right? That keep us, separate us. But
right.
I'm saying that in light of recent conversations with other people, Romanians, Koreans, like all these other people that they're like also kind of, struggling, but also, reclaiming this act of being a bridge. And like, I think it's really cool to, to reclaim it, right? And necessary,
right.
Far more than that.
Yeah.
And so, thanks for a little sneak peek of your book. And I can't wait. I don't know if you want to mention like when it's coming out, a little sneak peek.
Yeah, so we're looking at summer of next year. So there's still a little bit of time, but I'll talk more about it as, it gets closer and closer. I'll share more and more. But I'm super excited to be able to connect so many dots, with, our different communities, the land, this idea of reclaiming, this idea that, we learn from the land as a teacher, and we learn from our ancestors as teachers.
Yes.
And so this was such a fun conversation, Josh. Thank you so much for having it. And thank you, Vane, for, being so open and honest and vulnerable. And I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed talking about it. And join us next time for the Refuge Podcast.
Definitely. Peace.